Who came first?
Aunt Yetta.
No,
No, Aunt Bessie came first. Uncle Morris and Uncle Carl came first.
Okay.
And they went to Chicago because they were hired by the Ford Company or something in Chicago. They were both engineers. They had graduated from some kind of engineering school in Odessa. And they came first to avoid the draft. And because they were engineers, they came to Chicago. And then Aunt Bessie came over alone. And she went to Cleveland to her half-aunt, my half-great-aunt, who was her husband's mother.
Mm-hmm.
Aunt Bessie and Uncle Oscar were half-cousins when they were married. So Aunt Bessie came to Cleveland. And then, I'm trying to think who came next. Well, it would have been my mother and my grandmother came next. And they were wealthy. They didn't come over steerage. They had luggage. In fact, my grandmother was afraid that she wouldn't have a down comfort or down pillows. And they had one trunk that was filled with feathers, with down. And wherever they went, she wasn't worried about the clothes or the furniture or anything. She was worried about the trunk with the feathers, the down. So that followed them, and they went to Chicago. But Granny didn't like it in Chicago because her half-sister was in Cleveland. So and Grandpa wouldn't come to this country until he had a post. He was an ordained cantor. And he had a post in Odessa, and he wasn't going to leave there not knowing that he had a job when he came to this country. Let me think. The first job was in Chicago, and Grandma didn't like it in Chicago because her half-sister was in Cleveland. So she maneuvered.
Who was her half-sister?
Ebby's, Huddle.
Huddle. So Rachel's half-sister was Huddle.
Let me figure this out. My great-grandfather, his name was Shale. His wife had 2 sons, and then she died. And in those days, if you were married for 10 years and you didn't have children, you were automatically divorced. Well, he had 2 sons, and he wanted a wife who would take care of his 2 sons. So he married a woman who had been married and didn't have any children because he thought she would devote herself to his 2 sons. And she probably had about 10 kids. So the 10 children started with Yetta and Aunt Bessie, Evelyn's mother, and my mother. And then there was a younger child who died. But that's that part of it. Then they went to Chicago, but then because Grandma's half-sister, Huddle, was in Cleveland, Grandma wanted to come to Cleveland, and she maneuvered so that Grandpa got a post in Cleveland, and they all moved to Cleveland except Carl. My Uncle Carl remained in Chicago, and we never really knew him. We would see him maybe once every 5 years or so. I can remember driving to Chicago, and it was an overnight trip. We stopped in a roadhouse hotel. But it was my mother and me and my father's sister's husband, an uncle. And we were in a restaurant, and somebody said something to me. I was about 3 or 4 about my father. And I said, he's not my father, he's another man. And for years they teased me about that my mother was traveling with another man. It was her brother-in-law. But anyhow, that we got to Chicago to visit with Uncle Carl and his family. But that's all I remember about that. And then the family all came back, except Carl remained in Chicago, and the rest of the family had died.